Hey everybody, this is Nathan Branson here, and I'm going to talk today about Shelley's Frankenstein, specifically the first few letters of Frankenstein, some context on Mary Shelley, and the context of why she wrote this book and her life. And I want to talk about a few themes that you might see beginning, just to understand the framework of this novel, because sometimes when you start off a novel, it's good to have some good understanding of the structure of what the author's thinking, maybe a little cultural context to get things going so you understand where we're going, especially with this book. Since most people already know about Frankenstein, they know about the story structure, things like that. Yet, at the same time, when they open up this book and they see that it starts off with some letters from Robert Walton to his sister, they're like, "Is this the right book? Am I reading the right book?" Okay, so I'm going to talk about that as well. So a lot of people's background knowledge, which is good, comes from the movies that have been made for a long, long time. I think the first movie was made over 100 years ago about Frankenstein. It was an early film. And people kind of have this Halloweenish horror story association with it because that's what he's oftentimes associated with. The novels associated with. And then on top of that, we associate Frankenstein as being the monster. But in reality, there's Victor Frankenstein and then the monster. There's two separate things in the novel. Even I said it, he. What's up with that? Why is it like that? So I do want to say that if you do watch the film versions, maybe they're a little bit more like horror stories, but this book is more of a thriller, and you're curious about what's going to happen next. There is murder in the book, but it's not in the It's not in the fashion of murder and blood and violence that we see in R-rated movies that are horror movies today. This book was written originally 1818. And so our understanding of horror films in relation to what Mary Shelley's writing about is not the same. And this is a good thing. I don't like horror movies personally. I don't really find them I don't find them entertaining. But what I really like about Frankenstein, the first time I read this book, I was shocked at how philosophical and thoughtful and interested in sociological issues this book is. And I remember reading it when I was 20 years old at Barnes & Noble in Wilmington. I went to UNCW, and just being really impressed with I had my expectations were low because I don't like horror. And so it's exploring a lot of big questions, big philosophical questions. That's why we're reading it. And so that's to get into those elements. This novel does start a little slow, but some of the big philosophical questions that we are going to start to explore would be things like, why do human beings need belonging? What does isolation do to people? Should there be some kind of restriction on what science, how we can pursue science? Any boundaries as this book looks at a man creating another man. What are the positive and negative effects of self-education, as we see a lot of self-education in this book? Does evil come from society, the way society shapes us, nurture, or are people genetically sort of born with evil tendencies and ideas, nature, that idea. What does the creator owe the creation? Sort of almost like a theological question in some ways. And why are people prejudiced towards other people based off their appearance? So those are a couple of questions that Mary Shelley goes into in this novel. And so, like I said, it's less of a horror story, and we're looking at more of these philosophical questions. Along with the fact Mary Shelley is a really good writer, and her ability to communicate what her characters are feeling, thinking, the way they communicate is very good. It's good, and it has a lot of heart, I would say, along with these sort of heady questions that we're thinking about. So she grew up, Mary Shelley, lived in a community and a family of writers. If any person ever did, when you look at her life, it definitely was surrounded by writers. So she had that advantage in the sense that from the time she was a little girl, she was surrounded by writers. At the age of 4 years old, she heard Samuel Taylor Coleridge recite his poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Her parents had a party, and Coleridge was there, the famous romantic poet who we've read in our class. And he recites this poem, and it made a strong impression on Mary as a kid. Along with that, she married Percy Shelley, who wrote the poems Ozymandias and Mutability, which is what we read earlier this semester. And her husband's poem Mutability is quoted 2 times in her novel. And she was 19 when she wrote this, or started writing. It was kind of a work in progress. And so this particular, the Green Book, this version that we've got is the 1818 version. So this is the first edition. And so she published it, and around the age of 19 or 20, and then it slowly became more and more popular. But let's talk about her family a little bit more. Think about her mom. Her mom was Mary Wollstonecraft, and she wrote the essay A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was an early feminist, and that is in our textbook. That particular essay is in our textbook. It's about 20 pages long. Coleridge, also a family friend of her mom. 60 pages of our textbook is devoted to Coleridge. Percy Shelley, 50 pages to her husband. And Byron, Lord Byron, another poet, 25 pages of our textbook is devoted to that writer. So Mary Shelley's friends and family have over 150 pages of poetry, essays, and stories published in our textbook. And so this doesn't even include anything published by Mary Shelley. The larger version of the textbook, I got a specific, more shortened, actually not specific, more shortened textbooks, but the larger version has Mary Shelley in it. But this is just an illustration of she was around a lot of creative people, and that creativity rubbed off on her. And just this idea that writers support one another, they encourage one another, and whatnot. And I think it's also illustration, I think, of writers. Oftentimes, if you're a writer, it's a good idea to surround yourself and seek out other writers. Sometimes we have creative folks who are sort of hermits, and they don't seek out other creatives to do things. And so I think Mary Shelley's life in some way she was sort of lucky to have all these folks around her. Not to mention her dad was a philosopher, a famous philosopher. But I mean, it's just kind of a testament to what creative people can do when they also work together and support one another. With that said, why did she write Frankenstein? And part of this was She was on a vacation with Lord Byron and her husband, Percy Shelley. And they were in a mansion in Geneva, Switzerland. And Lord Byron, he challenged the other writers, they're on vacation, to write a ghost story. And it was during this time she began to draft out Frankenstein. And so I think, think of a 19-year-old girl and she's on this trip with these famous writers, established writers, Shelley, Percy Shelley, and then Byron. And she could have said, well, I feel kind of insecure. Maybe I don't know if I want to participate in this. I'll just listen to other people's stories. That's what she could have done. And that's probably what I would have done. I would have been like, these guys are experts and really creative. But maybe I'll just let my husband or, do his thing, and he'll write and I'll, maybe critique his work. Well, she decided, well, I'm going to actually share my story. So she surely endured some criticism, but at a young age, she wrote something and she shared it, even despite the fact of talents of these people. And this is what happens a lot of times in the face of talent. A lot of times we can shrink back and not share what we've created. And I do that myself, but I think it's a good time. It's a good thing to say, I have written something. I'm going to share it with you. You might hate it, but I mean, honestly, that's how we grow. We hear criticism from other people. So Mary Shelley, even though she was 19, she shared her story that she wrote with other people. As a writer, I have a blog. You're going to get some criticism. And so if you're interested in writing, just expect it, but also, expect to connect with people through your writing as well. So if you are interested in writing, are you seeking out people to share your work with? Let's talk about this story here. Why doesn't the story start off with the creation of the monster? There's this monster that we see. Why doesn't it start off with that? This is a choice for a fiction writer. Do they start off with one of the main characters, or do they build up? Okay, so you think about A Christmas Carol by Dickens. He started off with Scrooge from the get-go. So right at the beginning, we meet Scrooge. Opening pages, we meet Scrooge, and he's a jerk, and he's not a likable person. Okay, so from the beginning, we see that, and it's like, oh, this person's, that's good. That's a good method. Mary Shelley didn't do it like Dickens. She decided to kind of build it up a little bit of a slower of a beginning. And either of those are good methods if you're interested. If you're reading fiction, you want to kind of be aware of that kind of thing, and I think that those are methods to consider. So when we think about Frankenstein, it's more it starts with letters. So it's an epistolary letters, starting off letter. You would just read these letters by Robert Walton. And Karen Pryor, she's a professor. She's an expert on this particular story. She says, I think the literary genius is in the form and using the epistolatory style and nesting the story within a story within a story, because that's what we'll find that is at the heart of the story, the literal center of the story. The story about another family. So we'll see another story about another family in the middle of this that is not connected to Frankenstein and his creature until they encounter one another. So that is part of the way she's framed this, and people have praised the way she's framed the story. And yeah, so I can see that. So let me let me explain that real quick. So we have Robert Walton. We have Victor Frankenstein. We have the monster. And then we have the Lacey. Okay. So these are the story. This is the first story. 1, story 2, story 3, story 4. Okay. So we start off with Robert Walton's story, and then he meets Victor Frankenstein, and then Victor Frankenstein is telling Robert his story. So it's this sort of stories within stories. Okay. And that's something that is a method in seeing how they're connected. But yeah, this I think it's pretty unique. And what Karen Pryor is pointing out is just the uniqueness of her method of doing it, as opposed to just using a third person narrator. So a lot of times when you read a story, sort of like Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, you know, we have a third person narrator narrating the story and telling us what happens to Scrooge and the ghost and Fred and Bob Cratchit, and it's sort of somebody telling us sort of almost like a godlike perspective. Okay, whereas in this one we're hearing Robert Walton's perspective, Victor's perspective, the monster's perspective. Okay, and when we read those particular perspectives are a little bit subjective, and so should we trust Robert Walton? Should we trust Victor Frankenstein? And that's one of the things we can keep in mind as we read this. You know, how much should we trust them? But it also, you don't want to go down too much of the path of saying, well, we shouldn't trust anything. That's obnoxious. But instead, you want to just think about this is how we all are. We all tell stories, and whenever we do tell stories, we kind of have our own little versions of them. You know, so thinking about a letter, why is it that she decides to use letters, okay, instead of using just third person narration? Okay, and I think it gives this story a little bit more of a anticipation as you're figuring out, well, okay, here's Robert Walton. He's telling us he's this kind of lonely guy on a ship, and then he meets Victor, who is sort of lost in this world of frozen world of ice on he's floating on a piece of ice, and he finds him in the ocean, and then they become friends. And then there's Robert Walton's sister, and so Robert Walton's writing to his sister. But if we think about back in that time, as I've talked about with the letters, writing through the letters, through the epistolatory style, we think about 1818, whenever she first wrote this. There's no TV, there's no emailing, there's no telephones, there's no social media. So that the medium of the letter is something that people are used to, and that they're used to communicating long distance. Any long distance, a letter, you send a letter one person to another, maybe even across town, right? And it oftentimes, if you've ever sat down and written a letter to somebody, it kind of hits on a deeper level, allows you to think a little bit deeper in terms of what you're feeling. Okay, and I read a book recently by David McCullough, and it was about Teddy Roosevelt's family. And during I guess it was the 1830s or 1840s, Teddy Roosevelt's parents were dating, and Teddy Roosevelt's parents, one lived in New York City, and one lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And because these people had Teddy Roosevelt's mom, Teddy Roosevelt's dad had written all these letters to each other, David McCullough was able to write this book and understand a lot of the personalities of their family, a lot of the family history. So letters a lot of times lets us get to know people in depth in this unique way. In the same way, if you take in my 112 class, we read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and you get to know a little bit more about the personality of Martin Luther King by reading that letter, as opposed to just watching a speech. His speeches are great. You can understand about his message, but whenever you read one of his letters, you get to know him a little bit deeper. So you can get the personal lives are exposed a little bit more. So when we're reading Robert Walton, it's a matter of you could think, oh, these people using these big SAT words to express themselves. Why do they have to try to sound so smart? Well, you have to think about the limitations of what they were up against in terms of communication. Robert Walton didn't have a cell phone to text his sister, to call her on the phone. He couldn't send a meme, picture, a GIF. He couldn't even send an email. And so there was no post on social media that he could post about being stuck at sea in the ice. All he had was words. So they're not necessarily being pretentious by using some of these bigger words or sort of expressing themselves in these more emotional ways. It's just the way people they went a little deeper into their thoughts and feelings whenever they wrote these letters. In order to do that, they had to have a bigger vocabulary. And so the long form letter, as what we're reading in here, is something you have to consider what they don't have. They're deprived of some of these technological ways that we communicate quicker and through images. Okay, so if you saw a sunset at the beach, how would you communicate it to somebody who lives far away that you couldn't take a picture of it? And how would you communicate and describe that sunset? And so as you're reading this book, as you're thinking about these letters, I want you to think about that. I mean, even the idea of taking a picture with your phone wasn't even an idea or available till like 2007. So these are people living in an imageless world in terms of photographs. So they had to be really strong verbally. So they use a lot of words to help the other person have the full impact of what they experience. And also to remember, like, how can I remember this experience in the future? So, so when we read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we get the private account of Robert Walton, where here's private thoughts that he shares with his sister. And he's saying this, he's like, these reflections have dispelled the agitation with which I began my letter. I feel my heart aglow with enthusiasm, which elevates me to heaven, for nothing contributes so much to tranquilize the mind as a steady purpose, point on which the soul may fix its intellectual eye. So he's got this really incredible, that's one sentence with a semicolon. It's a little bit more complex language. Again, Mary Shelley's incredible writing, but also I think it's a sign of that time period that they had to communicate through letters, through using rich language, elevated emotional language, detailed language, and we shouldn't judge it because it's detailed. And we shouldn't judge it because he's expressing his deepest yearnings and longings. And so as we read this, let's keep that in mind. And then also maybe even you sit down and try writing a letter to somebody that you care about your day. like explain what happened to you on a particular day. Maybe there was something that really big happened, and you can't text somebody, you can't send somebody, you can't post on social media. How would you write that in a letter? You would want to be able to describe it in a deep way. Okay. So a big theme that we see also, I'm going to just go over one more thing, and that's the theme we see in Frankenstein, and that is the seeking friendship, and then also these specifically three men who, well, probably two men, are wanting somebody to listen to their story. Okay. And some say that, this is showing, well, I'll leave that for later. It feels like the reader we just let on seek allows us the reader to, okay, I've already said that, sorry. Robert Walton, let me get to this. Let me say it like this. Robert Walton says to his sister in page 35 of this book, he says this: I have no friend, Margaret. When I'm glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I'm assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in my dejection. I shall commit my thoughts to paper, it is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. So he's kind of saying that even letter writing has its limitations. I desire the company of a man who can sympathize with me, whose eyes will reply to mine. You may deem me romantic, my sister, but I bitterly won't feel the want of a friend. And we're going to see this theme within Frankenstein is the desire for friendship, the desire for companionship, the problem of isolation, and then in some ways, I guess you could say someone to listen to, I guess the desire to tell stories to a friend. Okay, this is my story. Can you listen to me? That's almost another theme that's separate from companionship. So if you think about it, how many people would openly admit they don't have a friend? I don't think many people in American culture in 2022 would openly admit that they're lonely. We're reading this, and maybe that's why Shelley wanted it to be a letter. This man's openly admitting to his sister he really wants a friend, and obviously she's going to be really loyal to him. She's his sister. I mean, he can trust her, but he also wants somebody there with him. And so you kind of think about this when you read these opening letters to this, don't just dismiss them, but you can kind of see into the inner thoughts of this guy. And then along comes Victor. Okay, so the Robert Walton's story, and then along comes Victor, and he is on the piece of ice, and then they meet each other, and now Victor says, listen to my tale. Okay, so now Robert Walton has somebody to talk to. He has somebody to express maybe his experiences with. He on this ship is a leader. So as you say, leadership oftentimes can be lonely. So in this case, he has somebody who he feels like is on the same intellectual level as him, as he says, and also Victor wants to tell him his story. And whenever he meets him, he says, I determined once that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you have warned me to alter my determination. You seek knowledge and wisdom, as I once did. I only hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be serpent to sting you as mine. I do not know that the relation of my misfortunes will be useful to you, yet if you are inclined, listen to my tale. So in this case, Victor's saying, well, I think I want to tell you this story about when I created a monster. Okay, So I'm going to tell you this story, and maybe you can find it helpful and you can understand me a little bit more. And so there's these two people who just want somebody to listen to them. And that is a big theme in this, not only with these two, but as you'll see, other people in this as well. And to think about that, again, that's a philosophical, sociological question. You know, when people are alone, what are the pros and cons of being sort of alone to do your own thing, to live out your ambitions? Maybe you have some big project you want to accomplish. But then on the other hand, what are the downsides of that you're sacrificing to live out your big ambitions? Are you sacrificing familial relationships to accomplish your ambitious goal? Things like that. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of the beginning of Frankenstein. I find it to be a lot of discussion points to explore. Even this is probably my 5th, 6th time reading the book. Enjoy reading it, and yeah. So I just wanted to give you that, just to kind of give you a little overview of what this book is, and the fact the best part of the book, in my opinion, is once the monster comes along. That's whenever it goes into deeper questions like the ones we're looking into, and it's a lot of these same questions. It's just we have more to talk about in relationship to when the monster does come along. Okay, some people call him the creature, some people call him monster, but he'll show up pretty soon here. Okay, so thank you guys, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You guys have a good day.